I'm all for intentional communities. I'm all for unintentional communities. I'm all for allowing additional people to occupy a space so long as it's inspected beforehand and they have the proper amount of lighting, they have the proper amount of square footage, and it checks out on all of our regulatory requirements. For it, 100% for it. Here's my issue. C1 through 5. It says, for purposes of this section, a family may include a group of 2 or more unrelated adults living together in a dwelling unit when operating as an intentional community. Factors that shall be considered. I want to make explicit note of this. It says shall be considered in determining whether a group operates as an intentional community include, and then it lists 5 things, including whether the members of the household share the entire dwelling unit, whether the members of the household have rules, a democratic governance, maintenance responsibilities, and household issues. So in other words, there's like an election and they're adopting a constitution and or a charter. 3, whether the members of the household unit share as their legal address for purposes of including but not limited to voter registration. So this is something that we're apparently looking into. Driver's license or identification purposes of, I'm assuming, that address, motor vehicle registration, and the filing of recent receipt of tax documents. This is stuff that we're going to be considering. 4, whether the group is transient or temporary in nature, and I don't know exactly how that's defined. And 5, whether the members of a household share expenses for food, rent, ownership costs, utilities, and other household expenses. So first I'll make the argument and then I'll ask the question. We're enforcing, or supposedly enforcing, these items that is in every single respect getting into people's dirty laundry. We're quite literally saying you have to have a democratic process that, elects somebody, puts up a constitution. You have to share expenses for things like food. So Franklin's supposed to get the milk this week and Suzanne gets the milk the next week. Somebody's supposed to do the sweeping and somebody's supposed to do the mopping, and you have to, this is stuff that we're actually regulating. And I'm a liberal, but this seems a little bit overboard as far as what we're going to be doing and what we're not going to be doing. So here's the thing. Let's be really clear. If we're going to be doing all of these things, I would argue adamantly that we should not. I think this is going to get us into all sorts of trouble. I feel like bias and even potentially racism can come into play. We're going to be checking out if somebody's motor vehicle registration. We're going to be checking their voter registration to see that they're registered at this particular address. This is opening us up to all sorts of problems. So if we're going to be enforcing it, I should say we shouldn't be. And if we're not going to be enforcing it, let's not have the language in there. Laws matter, words matter, and the best way to undermine government is to pass laws that can't be or won't be enforced. And that's precisely what we're doing here. So my question is simple. Are we going to be enforcing these things? And if not, let's not have them in there.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Fry. So I don't know if others want to be in queue and to either comment or express a response to questions. Councilmember Gordon, I know, has asked to have the floor.
Thank you very much, and I'm happy to talk about this. The key to those items that were read is our effort to define what an intentional community is. Other cities have done this, and they call it something like a functional family, or they have different terms for it. And essentially, people would be self-identifying, and they would want to know, well, what is an intentional community? And we've listed some things that aren't required, but they shall be considered in determining whether or not you're functioning as an intentional community. And they'll be considered by the group applying to do so. They'll look at those and they'll say, yeah, we share the entire unit, or else they'll say, oh no, we're all in a bunch of separate little apartment buildings. I guess we aren't really an intentional community. And those factors can also be used and considered if we have to make a call on whether or not this is an intentional community. The way the ordinance is set up, and if you look at the later section, people will fill out an application, much as people might fill out a form right now saying that we are domestic partners and we want to register with the city. So they fill that out. They're claiming that they are. We can give them a definition of what that means, and then they bring that to the city. And this is the same here. In this case, because people are concerned about it, we're actually asking them to go and get a notarized statement saying that and attesting that they're doing it. So we're taking people at their word. And then also, if there's questions later, we can go back and we can look at, well, here's the items we're supposed to consider. And if you actually look beyond that, then there's also some things that we would consider would indicate that you're not. If you're operating as a rooming house, there's some instances where you can't be functioning as an intentional community, so they're listed later. So these are things that shall be considered by the person or the group applying, and also if it comes to enforcing it, yeah, absolutely, they can be considered. But no, we're not requiring. It doesn't say shall be required to do the following. It says these are factors that shall be considered in determining whether a group operates as an intentional community or not. And I'll just note that these weren't identified lightly. There were lots of discussions. There were lots of community meetings. There was a coalition of groups interested in doing this. There was housing inspections staff, rental licensing staff that were included in the meetings and worked on these. And these were the items that met with the satisfaction of all those groups and community members as included in the definition of what is an intentional community.
All right. Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's important that we have this discussion because while this particular proposal has been described in some contexts as an incremental step toward relooking at our occupancy rates, I think it has a lot of underlying assumptions that are troubling to me as well. I think it's important to remember the history of zoning and of housing policy in our city and across the country, and to acknowledge that when we're making decisions. We recently designated an historic district that was one of the first integrated housing developments in the country. And before that, there were all kinds of rules in place, covenants and zoning restrictions that segregated our city and were racially exclusionary. And that is the history of zoning and housing policy in our city and across the country. And so I think that the thing that concerns me the most about the list of requirements is the assumptions it makes about why people live together and the impacts of people living together on their neighbors. It makes the assumption that if you share chores or you have a democratic governance in your home within the walls of your own home, ostensibly that you'll be a better neighbor to folks next door or across the street. And, you know, I live in a neighborhood that's filled with people living in all different kinds of homes and shapes and sizes. I happen to live in a single family home, and my neighbors have many, many people in a building that's about the same size. And they're not louder than we are. They're not troublesome. They don't break any of the rules that we have in our housing codes. But if they did, we have all kinds of regulations as a city that talk about noise, that talk about maintenance of our properties. And in my mind, it would be better, a more straightforward approach to look at our occupancy requirements and to address any troubling behavior or problems with properties through our other regulatory functions, and not to try to govern who gets to live together, to ask them to notarize their situation inside the walls of their homes, and to rather take a look at why we think we need to regulate how many people live within a building in a configuration. Why is it okay for folks to live in an apartment building as long as it has walls, but not live together in a big, old, beautiful home together if they choose to do so? Why do we care if they have shared chores? I think it, again, goes back to the assumptions that we are making about who gets to live together and who doesn't. And that's where I have concerns as well, particularly about these details that are listed in the housing portion that kind of outline so much interest by our city government in what's happening in between those walls of the home.
Okay. So I'm not seeing any other, did you have another?
I'm just going to finish up. Yeah.
Oh, okay. So Councilmember Frye should be in queue one more time.
Sure. So The answer to the question as to whether items C1 through 5 will be enforced, the answer is very clearly no, they will not. If they were to be enforced, I would absolutely vote against them because I think the implications are horrible. And since they are clearly not going to be enforced, I don't know why we're going to have them in there. You know, I think I mean, I understand the effort. I understand there was a long community engagement process, and I really sincerely do appreciate all the work that Council members Gordon and Goodman have put into this. But the quickest way to erode the confidence in government is to pass laws that can't be enforced and that won't be enforced. And we're explicitly saying on the dais here that these are not requirements and they won't be enforced. If that's the case, let's be really honest with ourselves and take these items out.
Councilmember Goodman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I take exception to the argument that this won't be enforced.
That's what he said.
Someone who comes in and says, I want to be an intentional community, and I'm a landlord, and I have 10 people who are coming to live with me, and doesn't have any of the other kinds of things in line that intentional communities need, won't get licensed to be an intentional community. So it will be enforced. Unfortunately, we often have to put regulations in place to predict what the worst people will do instead of the best people. And there is a legitimate concern in the community that this is just a way for bad landlords to get around occupancy requirements. So what I would say more than anything else is don't get rid of the good in lieu of the great. This is a good thing for people who live in co-ops. This is a good thing for people who currently live under the radar in intentional communities. It's stopping people from creating new intentional communities that meet the intent of co-op or cooperative type living. So I realize you'd like something different and better, but the process that was put together so far was mindful of the fact that occupancy in many parts of the city is still an issue, while allowing people who are doing good things, living together, be daylighted and not considered illegal.
Councilmember Frye.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Well, it's entirely within your prerogative, or anyone's prerogative, to take exception with my opinion. This is the language that is in the ordinance right now, and this is explicitly what one of the authors, the co-author, has said will happen. Now, I don't have a problem with D. I don't have a problem with the requirements as far as the notarization. And I certainly don't have a requirement that our inspectors go into the building beforehand to make sure that it's up to code, people aren't living in hard conditions, and that they're making sure that landlords are not we're not letting them take advantage of the neighborhood and the people living in the building. I'm all for that. The items, again, we got to be specific, are C1 through 5. And C1 through 5 says, shall be considered. The author of the ordinance says that they're not requirements and wouldn't be enforced. And so if that's the case, let's be really honest with ourselves.
Councilmember Gordon.
I also think the ordinance says there are items that shall be considered, and I think that's the hair that we're trying to split here. I think if you look at definitions of many other types of land use or things, how do we define a group residential facility? How do we define a lodging establishment? How do we define a fraternity and a sorority? We have definitions there that then are interpreted. What we're giving here is guidance of what an intentional community is, and these are factors that need to be taken into consideration. I think all our ordinances could probably always be perfected and improved upon, and I understand that Councilmember Frye has some particular issues with this section of this ordinance. I'll reread it and I'll look at it over again and I'll see. I just know that this is something that we've landed on and has passed the committee with I think it was a 5-to-1 vote of support. It's also been vetted with staff and community members, so I'm comfortable with the language.
Councilmember Bender.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to be more specific as well. And I think it's a fine point that this is the ordinance that's in front of us. We don't have an ordinance in front of us that's taking on the overall issue of occupancy. But I just wanted to walk through my concerns about these specific items. So whether or not members of the household share the whole dwelling unit and function as a single housekeeping unit. I'm concerned that that's overreach. I don't know why we need to require that members of the household have an adopted set of rules covering democratic governance, maintenance responsibilities, and other household issues. Again, I think that's overreach. I'm concerned about requiring that folks use their legal address when that is not true in other places. I think a lot of people register to vote at their, parents' house or something, and I don't know why we want to require voter registration in a certain location for individuals living in a particular way. Whether or not the group is transient or temporary in nature, I guess I would ask the authors, I could do that offline, about why the one-year calendar year piece was included. And then, whether or not members of the household share expenses for food, rent, or ownership of costs or utilities, in particular the food portion. Again, it's almost sounds ridiculous, frankly, to require people to share expenses for their food. So I think that a lot, if you look beyond this into understanding all of the language that talks about these not being rooming houses, which were made illegal in the city of Minneapolis in the 90s, new ones, there's a lot of other language in the ordinance that I think is trying to get at some of the other things that we are describing we don't want these to become. So again, the overreach of describing people's personal lives and how they pay for their belongings doesn't seem to fit within this ordinance.